The 85-year-old man barely brushed against the parked motorcycle. His hands trembled, his steps slow, but his apology was immediate.
"I'm sorry, son. No harm meant."
But the biker didn't care.
He punched him hard, sending Franklin Harris, a retired Marine, to the ground. Groceries scattered. Blood ran down his face.
His veteran's cap lay beside him.
Nobody helped. They saw the jacket and still looked away.
Frank sat alone on the bench, clutching what little pride he had left.
But just 30 minutes later, engines roared in the distance. A military convoy rolled in.
At the front, a commander in uniform, his son.
They didn't come for revenge. They came to remind everyone what honor looks like.
Frank Harris, 85, wasn't always the frail old man who shuffled slowly through supermarket aisles, gripping grocery bags like they were sandbags in a storm. There was a time when he was the storm, a force that stood between danger and the innocent. A United States Marine for 32 years, Frank had served in 3 wars: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each war left its mark, not just on his body, but in his soul. He enlisted in 1969, barely 18, with a buzz cut and boots that were too big. Within a year, he was knee-deep in the Mekong Delta, pulling brothers out of rice paddies under fire.
Vietnam was his introduction to death.
Iraq was his confrontation with chaos.
Afghanistan was his lesson in endurance.
Through every campaign, Frank never sought medals.
He sought mission. He believed in duty.
That belief cost him friends, time, and parts of himself that never quite came back. He retired as a master gunnery sergeant, a rank few ever reach.
But when you asked him about his service, he rarely mentioned accolades.
What he did mention with reverent pause was the ones who didn't make it. He'd point to the jacket he wore, worn thin at the cuffs and sun-faded at the shoulders. "This belonged to Mike," he'd say softly. Mike was a young Marine who served with him during the siege in Fallujah.
He took shrapnel meant for Frank and died holding the line. The jacket was returned with his belongings and Frank wore it every winter since.
Not for comfort, not for warmth, but for memory, for honor. These days, Frank's life was quieter.
A small apartment just off Main Street, coffee in the morning, pills for arthritis, a folded grocery list written in large shaky handwriting. He still saluted the flag every sunrise, even if no one saw. Still polished his boots out of habit, though he hadn't worn them in years.
What hurt him most wasn't age or even pain.
It was the way people no longer saw him. He was invisible now. The same man who once commanded battalions was now gently pushed aside by impatient shoppers.
The same hands that once gripped an M16 with steadiness now struggled to open plastic milk cartons.
He never complained. Marines don't do that.
But every time someone called him sir without looking him in the eye, or worse, didn't acknowledge him at all, a piece of something inside him flickered and dimmed. Still, Frank Harris carried on because that's what Marines do.
It started like any other Tuesday. Franklin Harris rose before the sun as he always did.
His knees creaked when he stood. The cold made his joints stiff, but the pain was familiar, predictable. After a slow breakfast and a hot cup of black coffee, he grabbed his cloth tote bag, the one with the faded CRF patch sewn onto the side, and set out for the grocery store.
Just bread and milk. That was all he needed.
He wore the Marine Corps jacket again. It was too warm for it really, but he never left home without it. Not because it was practical, but because it made him feel anchored, especially on days when his hands didn't work right or when the silence in his apartment stretched too long.
That jacket was memory. It was armor. The parking lot was full that morning.
Crowds of people moved quickly, heads buried in phones, carts rattling past like no one could see anything outside their bubble.
Frank moved slowly, deliberately.
He didn't trust his knees on sharp turns anymore. Every step was measured. As he passed a row of parked motorcycles, one stood out, sleek black, gleaming like it belonged more to a showroom than a sidewalk. He admired it in passing, but didn't realize how close he was until his grocery bag brushed the handlebar.
The bike rocked slightly. A plastic milk bottle shifted and clinked against a loaf of bread. Frank stopped immediately.
He turned, heart sinking.
"I'm sorry, son. No harm meant," he said, eyes searching for the owner. He didn't have to look far. A group of bikers leaned against the wall of the supermarket, sipping coffee and laughing about something Frank couldn't hear. But one of them, tall, broad, tattooed from wrist to neck, locked eyes with him. The laughter stopped. "You touched my bike," the man growled, stepping forward. Frank straightened up. "It was an accident. I didn't damage a thing, but it didn't matter." The biker closed the distance fast. No warning, just a flash of rage and a fist. The blow landed hard. Frank didn't have time to brace. He crumpled to the pavement. Groceries exploding across the asphalt. Milk spread like blood. The glass bottle shattered at his side. For a few seconds, the world went silent. Then came the sound of people moving, not to help but to walk faster, avoid eye contact. A teenager looked back then looked away. A mother pulled her daughter closer. The biker chuckled and rejoined his group like nothing had happened. Frank lay still, dazed. His cap had rolled a few feet away. The Marine emblem faced up, unnoticed. This wasn't combat. It was something worse, abandonment. But what no one knew was that a single pair of eyes had seen everything. A quiet store clerk, barely out of college, texting one word to a contact simply labeled, "Commander, it's your father." Frank Harris sat there, slumped on the cold curb, blood trickling from his nose and lip. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't cry out. His instincts built over decades of war told him to assess, to endure, to wait. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet, no one stood with him. The supermarket doors slid open and closed behind passing shoppers. Some glanced, most didn't. A young employee stepped halfway out, looked at Frank, and then disappeared back inside as if seeing him was a problem that could be ignored. His groceries lay scattered around him like the remnants of something sacred torn apart. The milk soaked into his pants. The bread was flattened beneath his hip, and his veteran's cap, the one with the golden Marine emblem, lay a few feet away, face up, catching the morning light, still waiting for someone to salute. Frank's hands shook as he reached for his handkerchief, a frayed square of cloth with the Marine emblem stitched into the corner, a gift from his wife before she passed. He dabbed at the blood on his chin, not for vanity, but for dignity. He didn't want to look like a man who had been forgotten. But in that moment, he was. He wasn't in Vietnam, where fellow Marines would drag each other out of fire. He wasn't in Fallujah, where bonds were forged in the heat of explosions. He was in a quiet American town, and not a single soul had lifted a hand to help him. That was what cut deepest. A woman pushing a stroller slowed as she passed. Her toddler stared wide-eyed at the man bleeding on the sidewalk. The woman pulled her child close and whispered, "Don't look." Frank heard that. Not the words, but the tone, the fear, the distance. He felt like a ghost. A relic people didn't want to acknowledge. And yet, from behind the supermarket window, one pair of eyes didn't look away. Louis Thompson, a quiet clerk who stocked shelves overnight to pay his way through a community college, had seen everything. He had heard the punch or seen the fall and watched as people walked on. He didn't know Frank personally, but he recognized the jacket. His grandfather had worn one just like it. Louis didn't confront the biker. He didn't rush outside. He wasn't foolish, but he did pull out his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he typed a short message to a contact saved under one name, Commander. The message was simple. "Sir, it's your father. He's been assaulted." Then he hit send and stared back through the glass. Outside, Frank Harris wiped the last bit of blood from his mouth and tried to stand. Not because he had the strength, but because even now he refused to let the world see him crawl. He didn't know it yet, but help was already on the way. The parking lot had returned to normal. Cars came and went. Conversations buzzed around the entrance. The biker who had thrown the punch was back with his crew, laughing like nothing had happened. The world had moved on, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Far down the road, a low rumble broke through the air. Not the sound of traffic, but of engines built for something more. The kind of engines that carried orders, not groceries. That sound grew louder, turning heads. Dust began to lift from the asphalt as a convoy of dark green vehicles appeared from behind the strip mall. A lead SUV followed by 3 military Humvees moving with silent precision. The cars didn't screech. They didn't need to. They arrived with authority. The lead SUV stopped at the front of the lot and its door opened with deliberate slowness. From it stepped a man in digital camouflage, boots clicking against the pavement. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, his jaw clenched, a man not here to argue, but to make things right. Captain Matthew Harris, Frank's son. He scanned the area quickly. When he saw his father on the bench, disheveled, bloodied, struggling to sit upright, his hands curled into fists, but he didn't break stride. He walked straight across the lot, boots pounding like a heartbeat. The soldiers who exited the Humvees didn't speak. They didn't need to. 12 of them spread out around the parking lot, taking quiet positions near exits, doorways, and corners. They carried no weapons, but they didn't have to. Their presence alone shifted the air. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Shoppers froze in place. Matt dropped to one knee beside his father. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "Are you hurt?" Frank looked up at him through tired eyes and gave a faint smile. "Only my pride. Nothing broken." Matt swallowed hard, nodded, and stood. His eyes found the store clerk, Luis, standing just outside the supermarket door. Luis stepped forward, hesitated, then pointed toward the group of bikers near the wall. "There," he said simply. Matt didn't hesitate. He walked toward them, his soldiers instinctively closing ranks behind him. The biker who had punched Frank saw the formation and stood, posture shifting from casual to defensive. He puffed out his chest, but his eyes darted, scanning uniforms, calculating risk. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, voice shaking more than he intended. Matt calmly held up his military ID. "I'm the man whose father you assaulted." A long silence followed, and for the first time that day, the biker understood this wasn't going to be ignored. The biker didn't laugh this time. He looked at the ID, then at the soldiers fanned out across the parking lot. Each one standing at ease, yet unmistakably ready. These weren't security guards. These were trained servicemen. Their presence said one thing loud and clear. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. Captain Matt Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You hit a decorated Marine, an 85-year-old man, my father." The biker's bravado crumbled. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Matt interrupted. "You didn't care." Before fists or fury could enter the equation, Matt reached for his radio and calmly contacted local law enforcement, requesting officers at Lincoln Plaza. Civilian assault, witnesses present. Victim is a military veteran. This time, the call wasn't ignored. Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the silence. 2 patrol cars rolled in, their lights flashing. The same officers who might have dismissed the incident earlier now faced a very different scene. Uniformed soldiers, a commander, a crowd watching. Matt didn't shout. He didn't demand. He handed over witness statements, the store surveillance footage, and calmly briefed the responding officers. There was no room for excuses. The biker was cuffed quietly. He didn't resist. His friends looked on, silent, now their earlier laughter gone. As he was led toward the squad car, a few nearby shoppers who had previously turned their backs now stepped forward, not to stop the arrest, but to bear witness. Louis Thompson stood beside them, arms crossed, eyes locked on the scene. He hadn't said much, but in that moment, he stood taller than anyone else. Matt returned to his father. He knelt once more, this time producing a small first aid kit from one of the Humvees. With steady hands, he cleaned the blood from Frank's nose and lip. Not with military efficiency, but with the tenderness of a son. "I should have been here sooner," he said, voice low. Frank shook his head. "You were where you needed to be. So was I."
As the sun began to dip behind the buildings, something shifted in the crowd. An older man wearing a Korean war cap stepped forward. He stood at attention, then raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Others followed. Men, women, veterans, civilians, people who had pretended not to see before, now seeing with new eyes. A silence fell, not empty, but respectful. It wrapped around Frank like a long overdue embrace. Matt stood beside his father as the last rays of sunlight caught the golden emblem on Frank's Marine cap. He looked around the lot once, just concrete and indifference, now transformed into a place where something sacred had been remembered. Justice had come not in anger, but in honor. The story could have ended in the parking lot, but some moments refused to fade quietly. News of what happened to Franklin Harris, the assault, the military response, the silent salute spread beyond the town limits. A bystander had recorded everything. The video, raw and shaky, captured more than a punch. It captured a forgotten truth that honor still matters and sometimes it has to march back into view. Within days, messages began arriving. Handwritten letters, emails from strangers, children sent crayon drawings of American flags. Veterans from all over the country reached out, some angry, others grateful, all moved. But no message struck deeper than the one from the local chapter of the American Legion. We want to recognize what you stood for, Frank, not just in war, but in peace. At first, Frank hesitated. He wasn't a man who sought applause. His service had never been about recognition. It had been about duty. But Captain Matt Harris, his son, his commander in another kind of war, gently insisted, "Dad, this isn't about ego. It's about legacy, about teaching people to remember." And so, 2 weeks after the incident, the town gathered at the Civic Auditorium. What was originally planned as a modest tribute quickly grew into a standing-room-only event. Local leaders, military personnel, school children, and veterans filled the hall. Rows of chairs gave way to rows of people standing along the walls. On stage, a wooden podium stood beneath a large banner: Service, Sacrifice, Sympathy. The mayor opened the ceremony, his voice unsteady with emotion. He spoke not just of the assault, but of the years that came before it. The years no one saw. Mr. Harris didn't just serve in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He served in silence when he came home. And now we are breaking that silence. The master of ceremony stepped forward next and read aloud Frank's record: 32 years in the United States Marine Corps, 3 major campaigns, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a quiet act of heroism in Kandahar that saved 9 men. As the list continued, the audience grew still. Some wiped tears. Others bowed their heads. Frank sat in his wheelchair, eyes down, cap in hand. When his name was finally called, the crowd rose as one. The applause didn't end quickly. It built, louder, fuller, until it became something more than sound. It became atonement. Captain Matt Harris stepped onto the stage, turned toward his father, and knelt, not as a commander, but as a son. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed a new medal in Frank's hand. Then into the microphone he said, "You fought for our freedom. Today we fight for your honor." And for the first time in years, Frank let the tears fall. Not for pain, not for sorrow, but because he finally felt seen. No one expected what happened next. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Franklin Harris received a formal request from the courthouse. It wasn't from a judge. It was from Derek Blay Morgan, the biker who had punched him. Frank read the letter twice. The handwriting was rough, the words direct, but underneath the ink, there was something more: shame. "Sir, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'd like to speak to you face to face before sentencing. No cameras, no excuses, just truth." At first, Frank wasn't sure. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with the man. But something in the Marine inside him whispered, "We don't just fight enemies. Sometimes we help them stop being one." So he agreed. The meeting took place in a small windowless room at the courthouse. No press, no uniforms, just 2 men from very different wars. Derek walked in looking like a shadow of the man from the parking lot. No leather vest, no swagger, just jeans, a plain shirt, and a face worn down by guilt. He sat across from Frank without speaking at first, then cleared his throat.
My dad was a Vietnam vet, he began. He came home angry, drank too much, took it out on us.
I hated the military for what I thought it did to him.
Frank watched quietly, letting the man speak.
When I saw you in that jacket, Derek said, voice cracking, I didn't see you.
I saw him. And I snapped. I was wrong.
He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. I don't expect anything from you, but I've started therapy and I've already signed up to do community service at the VA whether the judge makes me or not. Frank sat back in his chair, weathered hands folded.
You can't undo what you did, he said softly. But you can decide what you do next.
Then, in a gesture that stunned even the court staff observing behind the glass, Frank reached across the table and placed a hand on Derek's arm.
Turn this into something. Don't waste the pain.
The judge, moved by the meeting and the actions Derek had already begun, sentenced him to probation with mandatory counseling and 500 hours of service at the VA hospital.
Derek didn't just comply.
He showed up early, stayed late. He helped elderly veterans in wheelchairs reach their appointments, cleaned floors, delivered meals, listened more than he spoke. Months later, he stood beside Frank at the annual Veterans Day parade, not as a reminder of violence, but as proof that people can change. And when a young boy pointed at Derek's tattoos and asked if he was a soldier, Derek smiled, then looked at Frank.
No kid, he said. But I'm learning what it means to serve. Frank Harris never asked to become a symbol.
He would have been content living out his remaining days in quiet, routine, early coffee, short walks, and folding his grocery list just right.
But life had different plans.
After the ceremony and the biker's public apology, the town saw Frank differently, not just as a veteran, but as a teacher.
It started small. A local elementary school invited him to speak during a history class.
The principal thought he might tell a few war stories and call it a day.
But Frank didn't talk about battles.
He talked about loyalty, about what it meant to hold the line even when no one thanked you, about the difference between being brave and being kind. The students listened, really listened in a way that surprised even their teachers. When he finished, one little girl raised her hand and asked, "Do heroes ever feel lonely?" Frank smiled, his voice soft, only when people forget to see them. Word spread. Soon other schools invited him. Then local radio stations. A veterans outreach group asked him to join their advisory board. Even the police department reached out requesting his help in training officers to better understand the silent struggles many older veterans face: PTSD, trauma, the need for dignity in everyday encounters. Frank didn't seek attention, but he accepted the responsibility. He met with rookie officers and gave them one message. Your job isn't just to enforce law. It's to protect the people who once protected you. Captain Matt Harris, now promoted and assigned to a regional leadership post, worked with his father to create a pilot program called Operation Honor. Its goal: connect retired veterans with high school seniors, pairing wisdom with energy, story with promise. Even Derek Blay Morgan got involved. After completing his court-ordered community service, he didn't stop. He became a volunteer coordinator at the VA, helping veterans with transportation and check-in support. He credited Frank for giving him a second chance at being the kind of man my dad wanted to be. But Frank's greatest impact wasn't in classrooms or council meetings. It was in the simple moments. In the way strangers stopped him at the park to shake his hand. In how parents pointed him out to their children and whispered, "That man helped make this country what it is." In the respect restored not just to him, but to every gray-haired veteran sitting quietly in diners, waiting rooms, and bus stops, no longer invisible. One morning as Frank sat on a bench sipping coffee, a teenager approached. "Sir," he asked shyly, "were you really a hero?" Frank looked up, eyes gentle but firm. "No," he replied, "but I served with a few. And I remember them." And with that, the old Marine tipped his cap, not for himself, but for all those whose legacies he now carried. The street sign went up quietly one morning. Veteran Franklin Harris Way. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a quiet nod from a grateful town to a man who never asked for thanks. Frank walked by it often, hands in his pockets, his old Marine cap resting gently on his head. He didn't pause to admire it.
He just kept moving the same way he always had. Life had slowed down, but the meaning in his days had only deepened. At the park, children now waved. Young men stopped to listen. The man who once felt invisible now carried a quiet gravity wherever he went. Not because of the punch, not because of the military convoy, but because of how he responded with dignity, not rage. With forgiveness, not pride. Frank often said the greatest lesson he ever learned in uniform wasn't how to fight. It was how to stand tall when the world looks away. And now others were learning to look again. Across town, Derek Morgan, the man who once struck him, now helped others rise. At the VA, he wheeled veterans to their appointments, asked for their stories, and listened like their words mattered. Because now, to him, they did. On Veterans Day that year, as the town gathered under the golden leaves of autumn, Frank stood beneath the flag, saluted slowly, and whispered a promise he'd carried for decades: "I didn't forget you." And now they won't either. Frank Harris's story reminds us that honor isn't something you outgrow. It's something you live even when no one's watching. In today's fast-paced world where age often makes people invisible, his quiet resilience challenges us to ask, have we forgotten how to truly see one another? A simple act of cruelty led to an entire town rediscovering what respect, forgiveness, and community really mean. But this isn't just about one veteran. It's about all the men and women who walk beside us every day, scarred, silent, and too often overlooked. What would our communities look like if we treated every elder like someone who once held the line for us? What if we taught our children that real strength comes not from fists, but from humility and service? Frank didn't respond to hate with rage. He responded with grace. And because of that, a town changed. A man changed. And maybe, just maybe, we can too. So, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right in an unexpected way? Do you think our society still values its elders and veterans the way it should? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, especially in conversations like these. And if this story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe to Valor Stories, and help us share stories that honor the quiet heroes among us. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins with simply remembering.